What's going on, everyone? Thanks for tuning back into the channel. Appreciate all the support. Thanks for watching. I got a good update. Met some folks who have been watching the channel. They came to church with us last week. Just want to give a shout out to those guys and say thanks. It was great to meet you. Privileged to have you in our congregation, and look forward to meeting many of you next month at the conference. So I hope you'll plan on meeting us out there at Berean. Today I'm going to do a video on Hebrews chapter 11, and I've been getting a lot of questions specifically about the resurrection of the dead. And people will ask, what do you guys think about the resurrection of the dead? Well, number one, we do believe in the resurrection of the dead. We may just talk about it a little differently than some folks do. When we say resurrection of the dead, we really begin to think about what happened in the garden, what happened with Adam and Adamic death. Whenever most people think about Adamic death, they strictly see it as physical. God told Adam, He said, the day that you eat of this tree, you will surely die. And most people will say that Adam began to physically die that day, and maybe some 900 years later, Adam actually died. Well, I would like to press the point and talk about how God told Adam and Eve that the day that they ate, that their eyes would be opened. Now, were their eyes open the day that they ate? And I believe that the answer to that is yes. If the answer to that is yes, and the same Hebrew wording is used that the day that they ate, that they would die, then how is it not also necessary that they die that day? And when we say death, meaning spiritual death, I would point you to verses such as Isaiah 59:2, that sin or iniquity has made a separation between God. So if you ask the question, did Adam die that day? My answer would be yes, Adam did die that day. As he was kicked out of the garden, he was kicked out of the presence of God. So since Adam was kicked out of the presence of God, God placed the cherubim at the garden to guard entrance and access back into God's presence. So when we talk about death in such a way, we mean spiritual death, that Adam, because of sin, was separated from God. And if you follow the rest of the Bible pattern, all throughout really the Old Testament story, and really, I think the groundwork that's being laid there is that worship happened repeatedly at a distance. And the best example of it is in the temple. How there was an outer court, there was an inner court, and only the high priest could come back into the presence of God, into the most holy place. So, what begins to happen is, throughout the biblical redemptive story, Christ he accomplishes the work, and He begins that work at Passover, when Christ dies for the sins of the people. Now, if you read the New Testament, you'll understand that salvation becomes then a process. So this is when we start talking about the already not yet. Once the redemptive work was completed, Christ began to bring men back into the presence of God, and He did so by fulfilling the Old Covenant law. So whenever Christ begins this work, you'll start to read things in the Bible such as, we now see Him in a mirror dimly, but then we will see Him face to face. And then, for example, in 1 Corinthians 13, Paul talks about when the perfect comes. And the perfect would be when the redemptive work was finally completed and men would go back into the presence of God. Now, one thing I think that throws a lot of people off, and maybe a lot of people haven't even had thoughts about Hades before. Hades meaning the realm of the dead. When Abraham or Moses or David died, they didn't go to heaven. Now, some people believe that, but other people believe they went to Hades and that they left Hades at the ascension. Well, the issue with that is the book of Hebrews makes it abundantly clear that no one went back fully into the presence of God while the first temple was still standing, or had standing, in Hebrews chapter 9. But if you'll notice another thing too that I really don't think a lot of people have thought about, is that the saints in Hebrews chapter 11 were still waiting to inherit the heavenly city. In Hebrews 11 it says that Abraham was looking for a city that was made by God. And this city was waiting to be inherited still by all those Old Testament saints. Well, one thing the New Testament makes clear is that the living saints would inherit at the same time as the dead saints. That's why you read things such as 1 Thessalonians that talk about the dead in Christ rise, and those who are alive were called up. Now, a lot of people have taken that as a physically called up off the earth, but I would proclaim that that is a covenantal restoration for the living and the dead. This is why passages such as 1 Corinthians say, we will not all sleep, but we will all be changed in the moment, in a twinkling of an eye. And I think that changing is the perfection that Paul talked about in 1 Corinthians 13. And the reason the perfection could come at the last trumpet was because the law at that point had been fully fulfilled. This is why Paul quotes Isaiah chapter 25 and verse 8 in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and he talks about bringing an end to death at the destruction of the law. Now, why would death be at the destruction of the law whenever the law passed away, as everyone agrees that the Old Covenant has, or I think clearly should be if you're watching this? How does that coincide with one another? Well, here's how. The resurrection happens when God brings an end to Adamic death. God brings an end to Adamic death once the Mosaic law is fulfilled, which magnified Adamic death. So the resurrection happens at the time the Old Covenant passes away. But you have to understand the way that Paul is using Adamic, the way that he's defining death. He's not talking about a physical death. Obviously, Christians today still physically die. Why would Jesus say a statement such as this, though, in John chapter 11? He who lives and believes in me will never die. This is because the fulfilled work of Christ brings an end to Adamic death, not for everyone, but for those who are in the city, in the new heavens and the new earth. So, when you start thinking about it that way, and you get to Revelation chapter 1 and verse 18, Jesus says, I have the keys to death and Hades. Now, you start thinking about death and Hades and how Christ would build his church and the gates of Hades would not overcome it. So Christ ascends, he prepares, he builds this spiritual temple, the house made without hands. Once it's completed, God brings an end to Adamic death. The resurrection out of Hades happens, and the living are covenantally transformed. And those of us who are saved today go into heaven and not to Hades upon our physical death. That's why you could say, everyone who lives and believes in me will not die. This is, I think, the thoughts that need to come to our mind when we talk about death, Adamic death, when we think about the law, and we think about the finished work of Christ and what he's done covenantally to bring us back into the presence of God. Let me just read you the final verse in Hebrews 11. Verse 40 says, God, having provided something better for us, that they, all of the Old Testament dead saints he just listed in the Hall of Faith in Hebrew 11, that they should not be made perfect, their resurrection and their perfection, apart from us, the living saints at that time. What was the guarantee of this? Well, the first fruits and the gospel, those who were saved in the first century, their salvation was necessary to guarantee the dead saints. The salvation of Israel, salvation came through Israel. Salvation was of the Jews. It had gone to the Gentiles. The Jew and Gentile were formed back in together. The dead and the living were covenantally restored to God through the finished work of Christ at the passing of the law. And that's how he brought it in to Adamic death. Thanks for watching the channel. Like and subscribe down below. God bless you, and we'll see you soon.